And then I will let you know also that we do sometimes have an after party for those of us who don't want to go back to the real world. Feel free to hang around with us. It's fun too. We have a good time with that as well. So everybody, I'd like to welcome you. I believe this is episode 13. That's unbelievable to me. Episode 13 of the interviews of the enthusiastic whiskey hobbyist. Today, we're honored to have Jeff Walsh from Oppidan Distillery. So Jeff, welcome. And can you tell us what you're drinking tonight?
Well, tonight I'm going with probably one that everybody was having a hard time finding. It's our bottled and bond malted rye whiskey. It dropped to our distributor shortly before COVID hit, and then our ability to do store tastings and all that obviously completely disappeared. And
right.
So we haven't made a big push on it, but it's still one of my favorites. Kind of my two right now are that, and then we've been doing single barrels mostly out of the tasting room.
Okay.
So we have a cask strength one that I really love. It's a slightly higher wheat percentage. But
and are those available in retail locations or just up in your tasting room now?
The bottled and bond, it's funny. I haven't looked to see exactly. I mean, honestly, it was all of one barrel that I just always loved, and I kind of let ride on the malted rye. The malted rye in general has always been our youngest whiskey. It was averaging around 18 months. So that one's, it's not super old either, but it's at 4.5 years. And I loved it when it was a year old. I loved it 2 years old.
Oh, nice.
And just kind of let it ride. And I think we gave the distributor Winebow, our local distributor, 20 cases.
Uh-huh.
But I haven't entirely looked to see where it went. And as I already stated, I kind of let Binny's do what it wants. Obviously, that's where I'd like to see it. I wouldn't expect it to hit every store, but a few stores there.
Right. Well, you're also, Winebow, you're working with Monique, and Monique is a wonderful advocate, and her knowledge is just amazing. I've known Monique for years. Many people here have as well. We had her on for the interview as well. And she's wonderful. She tells some good stories about Brett, which are always fun to hear. But I always like when I talk to Brett about retailing. He tells me things about, shelf space and how they determine who gets what and where. And it's just a whole world that people who are not in that world don't understand exactly how it all works, but that's good.
Okay.
So the first thing I'm drinking tonight is something that I have not yet tasted. Okay. This is your small batch Solera bourbon, French oak, and Oloroso. Okay. So tell me about the juice that's in this while I taste it.
Well, the juice on that, I would say it actually bounces around just a little bit. But in general, you're looking at a mash bill average 70% corn, 23% malted rye whiskey, 2% chocolate malted rye, 2% specialty, and then 3% two-row. So then aged, you're looking usually around 2.5 years in full-size cask now, American oak, then about 6 months to a year in French oak, and then on the Oloroso, it's kind of all over the place, just depending on how new the barrel was that we were using at the time. I think I was pointing out to Paul one night I did a bottling, and let's say I usually taste them, but it was in a hurry and we needed to get 10 cases out the door the next day, and I'm like, well, that was a new sherry barrel. Oh wow, it was kind of a sherry bomb. But occasionally there's a little variance there. I think that was like batch 22 is very, very sherry.
What's involved in getting those casks, the sherry casks?
Well, in my case, I think I've always bought them through Rocky Mountain Barrel Company. So at the end of the day, they are an importer, and they're really geared towards the U.S. craft beer industry. So you kind of get, what those guys are demanding. Maybe not so much. I guess sherry is probably not in demand by them, so that comes from the distiller side. But for instance, on the Smoke and Sea, I can get them when there's a big enough craft brewer that wants to bring in most of the container, and I can get 8 of whatever they're going to be. And the funny thing is they won't tell me what they are until it hits the dock.
So it's really funny. That discussion has jumped ahead for me. That was a question later, but no, it's all good. I have no problem with this because I'm not I have the smoke and see with me here, and as you know, you don't want to start off with something smoky. I was going to drink that later, all right? But I learned about this from Brett Pontani, okay, at
Okay.
Binny's. So there's somebody on here, Todd Coe. Todd, raise your hand so we can see you waving. So Todd and I every year host a table, a craft whiskey table for a homeless shelter that we support. And
I think you went on mute, Gil.
I'm back. That was weird. I got muted somehow. All right. Anyway, so I was saying that Todd and I support a homeless shelter, and we host the craft whiskey table every year. And Brett and I, with Todd and other people, we select what the whiskeys are. And we had Smoke and See one year, and I got to tell you, the people who came to the table, it blew them away. Now, of course, the people who hate smoke and who hate, brine, for them, it turned them off. Other people, they just fell in love with this stuff. So as soon as Todd and I smelled it, it's funny what you just said, so I'm going to call you on it. We smelled Lafroig is what we smelled. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you actually know what the casks are?
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, they're labeled when I get them. Like
Okay.
you can
Are
see the
you allowed
history.
to tell us?
I have no idea, but I'll tell you, it's Lafroig.
Oh,
Well, it
all
depends.
right.
I'd say this: if you look at our tasting notes, batch 1 and 2 were 50-50, so it was half Ardbeg, half Lafroig, and then
Okay.
everything from then, all I seem to manage to get are Lafroig. And personally, I had a leaning towards the Ardbeg barrels. It's to
Well,
me a cleaner
Ardbeg and
malt.
Lafroig are very different. Lafroig, much more iodine, much more brine, much more of the sea, as
Right.
opposed to the smoke. So, it's very different. I got it. So you're telling me that every year that this comes out, it's going to be slightly different because the barrels will be different?
Well, from after batch 2, no, for the most part, they've always been Lafroig. So
Okay.
there hasn't been a deviation. There has been on the last couple well, not the last batch, but a couple batches ago. Then suddenly we were dealing with quarter casks instead of 53 gallons. They were 42s. Not sure we quite call that a quarter cask or
Right.
what it is, but
Well, that makes a big difference. Even Monique told us that a lot, with somebody with Monique's refined palate, she says that sometimes she can taste almost immediately if something was aged in a smaller cask, from the amount of wood that she gets from it.
this is, I mean, in this case, I mean, she might be able to tell. I guess I would say
Well, I didn't say I
it's
can.
right. Well, I was going to say it's a finishing step, right? So it didn't sit in there for 10 years like the Freud might have. Instead, you're looking at sitting in there from anywhere from 2 to maybe a year. Like the longest I think we had anything in those was actually the Delilah's cask, so their 24th anniversary whiskey. That wasn't bourbon, but that was kind of the segue into dealing with peated finishing, and it was it was some malted rye that we had. Let's say in general, our malted rye we're getting from Canada Malting, and we got a batch that came from Thomas Fawcett's and Sons, so UK maltster, and there's definitely, I would say, terroir. Like it was completely different in the sense that it had this big underlying grassy note, like a rum agricole grassiness to it. I think I had 10 barrels of it. There were 10 30-gallon barrels of it from that batch. And, you're trying to slowly like blend it in 1 cup at a time without
Right.
throwing off your profile. And you get a little frustrated and say, okay, we need a better answer. And that's where we did 2 finished in Lafroig barrels, and they both sold as private barrels. So we sold
Okay.
one to
Nice.
Volstead up in Minneapolis, and the other one to Mike Miller. So it was, and then the rest of them went into our Cane and Rye. So it was
Okay. Right.
taking.
So before we get on to Cane and Rye and the other things, so the juice that has gone into both of these, is it
Yep.
essentially the same juice, and it's just that they're aged differently?
Um,
Because the mash bill of this, you were very specific in what the mash bill was.
right.
Is it
So
the same as what we have in Smoke and See?
the smoke and see bounces around a little bit. So like batch 1 and 2, for instance, going back to the original, it was about 3/4 from the Solera, but before the Oloroso cast. So it's going American oak, French oak, and then going into, well, Ardbeg and Lafroig back then. So then
Okay.
Now we've bumped up the amount that's from the 4 grain, and mostly partly for inventory reasons, and partly it came around to me more. I guess the 4 grain on batch 1 and 2 were going into Ardbeg barrels, and somehow they seemed a little more boring. So I
Okay.
leaned more on the Solera, and now I kind of like the way the wheat component plays off on the Lefroy better. So I've shifted. So that's why, not the world's best website, I'll admit, but we do put the batch notes there, and so we don't get in trouble. It says Ard and Laugh barrels. It doesn't
Nice.
give you,
Well,
but
I mean,
you know
Compass Box, years ago, Compass Box, in their earlier versions, they actually were able to put the names of the distilleries on their labels, from
okay.
all their blends, and they can't do that anymore. So they sort of put it on their website, and I think they sort of hide it there too. By the way, you said something very interesting there that reminded me of a conversation that we had with Joshua Hatton and Jason Johnstone Yellen from Single Cask Nation. They taste many, many barrels when they go to distilleries as they're bottling, and I asked them, how do you know when you found something that is worthy, of your bottlings? And Jason said something interesting. He said, I keep going back. He keeps going back to it. And what you just said about, tasting something and it wasn't necessarily, as special as you wanted it to be. You go back to something else. So that's interesting to me. What also is interesting to me though about you, and with Oppidan, is that you're aging your stuff in many different kinds of barrels. Okay, which to me is very interesting for a domestic, for an Illinois distillery. Who decides exactly what the barrels are going to be? How does that work? Is this all you, or is this you with a team?
Um, I mean, to a degree, it's all me, but to a degree, you'll send samples to, if I want to throw something at the guys at Binny's, to Joe Maloney and Brett.
Mhm.
Usually, well, as I said, maybe more intimidated by Brett, so I throw it to Joe. Um, but or Monique, Paul has the single malt, which you can give me an idea what he thinks of it tonight.
Paul has everything. Paul has everything.
It was a little. I mean, we made all of a batch, and that was a funny one because thought it was terrible off the still. Just so it was grain in, so
Mhm.
it wasn't loudered, and you had all this tannin and kind of rubbery notes, and you're like, well, do I throw it down the drain? Well, we got excess barrels, let's throw it in there. Some
Mhm.
used cast, I mean, so it went into 15-gallon barrel used cast for two years, 3 months, and then after that, threw it in an Ardbeg barrel for
Okay.
a little over 3 years now.
I
So
like that
it's
process because Lou Bryson, we were talking with Lou, and I think if I remember correctly from Lou, he thinks that how something is aged in the barrels that you put it in are something like 80% of what you end up getting. He says that the juice itself is something like 20, and how you're finishing it and what else you're doing with it. Now, of course, that's arguable, but it's the kind of thing where you tasted something you weren't necessarily so sure it was great, and then you decided, well, we're going to do something else with it. So it's an interesting process.
yeah. I mean I saw that as a question you were kind of asking. I imagine for craft, or I shouldn't even say craft, just younger distillers,
Hmm.
it's probably more liquid heavy just because it's not sitting in the barrel for as long, right?
True.
So take our smoke and see, on average, you're between 3 to 5 years of age. It's not, Weller 12. It didn't sit in there for 12 years. And,
Hmm.
the barrel, it has a lot of influence. I can say I like some of our white dog, but I don't ever I'm not going to come home and choose to drink our white dog over, whatever, more or less whatever commercially available whiskey, because something aged is better. I mean,
Right.
that's,
No, of course it is. But by the way,
um,
I haven't given you my opinions yet on this. This is delicious, and I do taste the chocolate. I'm getting the chocolate. I'm getting good warmth and heat, in the mouth and going down here a little bit. Um, it's rich, it's full bodied. I'm really enjoying this. So this is the Solera bourbon for everybody, just so you see it here. And I'm actually going to be moving on to the smoke and see here in about a minute. But you did mention a word that I had put in my questions to you ahead of time. What is a craft whiskey? We've had, we see Beam, and by the way, Beam does produce some great stuff, and they have their signature craft series, some of which are delicious, but they're generating so much of it. How do you define what craft is?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't worry about it. That's up to the consumer. And I mean, for the most part, we don't use the term um, because it doesn't mean a whole lot. I mean, I'm pretty sure the big guys aren't going out of their way. And I'm not saying they are making bad whiskey, but they're not going out of their way to make something taste bad. They want to make every batch as good as possible, right?
Right.
They might make certain decisions on, if you say that continuous column makes no heads cut at all, I mean, that is what it is. But, some of it, for us, I couldn't even say if that would make a difference. People say
Right.
you can leave more of some of these things in. Well, but I'm not aging it for 12 years. So I don't know what it tastes like 12 years from now.
Right.
I can say, it's like,
it's funny. Brett and I talked about this because, as I told you, every year he and I work with, Todd and a few other people to come up with a lineup for that homeless shelter. And with this year, since we're doing it virtually, we wanted to keep it pretty simple. Okay. We wanted, 2 bourbons, 2 ryes, and 2 American single malts. Right. And when we were looking at the bourbons, we looked at some of the Michters, and he said, no, they're making way too much of that to call it craft. So he looked at it from that perspective. And we are going to have, a Oppidan rye is one of the ryes there. And by the way, he introduced me to Oppidan rye because several years ago at the craft table, we had Old Potrero rye out of San Francisco. And I told him that I liked it and I wanted something else that was similar. And he said, well, if you like that, try Oppidan. They're local and you're going to love it. And he was right. Great stuff. So good. That's another good word there for Brett. What I also want to ask you is something about one of your other products, because we're seeing more and more of this. Whiskey producers who are also producing gin. Okay. Well, gin seems to be getting more popular and more whiskey drinkers seem to be including gin in their repertoire. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you've seen in the marketplace?
Well, I mean, the only ones that jump to mind that were whiskey only, and then suddenly you see gin, or it's like you're seeing it from Nika and stuff like that coming out of Japan. In our case, we were always making a gin. Gin and malted rye were the first whiskeys, or the first products. And the malted rye, honestly, was just, I did 243 variations on the gin before just saying, okay, this was the recipe. And some of it was varying what the base spirit was. And malted rye, I thought made a terrible gin, but I really like the mouthfeel of the malted rye by itself. Oat was another one that was like, mouthfeel was amazing, and it was like the easiest sipping gin. But for the most part, people aren't sipping gin, and it made a terrible gin and tonic. So you're like, well,
right. It's not going to make a good gin and tonic. What's the point? Right.
Right. So, we've been doing gin from day one. Now, that said, 90+% of our business is bourbon. And I mean, even the malted rye, I mean, it's a minuscule draw compared to the bourbon. So
let's talk about the bourbon for a minute then. Is your corn, is it all Illinois corn that you're dealing with?
Well, let's put it this way. I don't buy straight from the farmers, but I buy from Clarkson Grain. So it's out of Cerro Gordo, Illinois.
Okay.
So I know the mill is local, and then like on Ryan Wheat, it's always been coming out of Effingham, Illinois. So, I mean, on some level, you can be green a little bit, because what's the point having all this excess freight and moving? I mean, it's very heavy stuff.
Right, you want it to be closer, of course.
Right. But do I personally know the farmers and what have you now? I mean, I actually tried, you had Nick on last time. I actually tried to see if I could buy some rye and stuff from him, and it was a hard no. Okay.
Have you spoken with Welter from Journeyman?
Are they growing grain now?
Yeah, I think that. Yeah. I think that when we interviewed Welter, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't he say that one of the reasons he got into this is because his family has all these farms? If I remember that correctly.
No, I think he is. I think he's growing rye, or he's starting to grow grain now, but he wasn't originally.
Okay. I thought there was some farms there, but we talked about that. I might have to go back now and rewatch that that episode just to see exactly what was there. On that note, though, I don't want to monopolize this stuff, and Eric, before we open it up to everybody else for questions, do you have any questions yourself right now?
Yes. So, I mean, first of all, I will definitely go on record saying the Old Tom Gin is one of my favorite gins.
Thank you.
I've liked it since the first time I tasted it at World of Whiskey's, what, 4 or 5 years ago, when you guys first showed up at there. So great. Not happy that I can't easily get it, but
Well, neither am I. I mean,
yeah. But I will be getting a bottle one way or another soon. Back to the earlier topic of conversation when you were talking about barrels. Just something interesting I thought about is like, do you know when you buy barrels, how long those barrels have been used? I mean, when you buy a barrel, is it okay? It's been aging something for 2 years, or is it been aging something for 20 years?
sometimes, with the sherry barrels, ours were 40-year-old sherry casks. I knew that as I was buying them. Most of what I've been seeing recently are 2 to 3-year-old. And honestly, we haven't really rejuvenated in a while. I'm actually kind of surprised how much sherry it still kicks off. I mean, we have thrown more in over time. It's not like the original few barrels, but I've kind of held out. But sometimes they drive you crazy too. I have a 500-liter sherry butt that I can't get to stop leaking. And you're like, well, they're so damn hard to get. And it was funny, I had my brother at the distillery. He's like, well, why don't you just spin it? I'm like, it weighs 1,300 pounds. How are you going to spin that thing? It's sitting on I had these custom welded racks so we could forklift them and stack them. And like, you're just going to, and it was driving him even more crazy. So we're like trying to use wax, trying to use beeswax, trying to whatever we could to get the thing to stop leaking.
You need MacGyver. You need MacGyver to come and figure out how to do it.
Well, and then the question is, if you spun it, like you'd literally have to turn it upside down. Would that bung just pop out, and then you have a heart attack right there as you watch 500 liters of whiskey, just hit the floor?
Yeah, that wouldn't be
good. Let's say it was a bad day. The Delilah's barrel did go off the front of my forklift. I lost all of maybe a case to the floor. I mean, it smelled amazing. But
there are many people on here who are big fans of that Delilah, Delilah bottling. And when you just said that, I don't know about you, but I shuddered a little bit just thinking about that.
I was and Mike Miller was on the way up too, so that didn't didn't help. But it wasn't awesome. It's like I jumped off the forklift so fast, I left it in gear, and I almost ran over myself trying to flip the barrel back up. So it was awesome.
Yeah, awesome. Sounds like something that should have been videoed, and we'd see that on YouTube, Well,
it was like, I say there's the angel share, you can call it the devil share that stays in the wood, and that was the asshole share. That is what it is.
I hate to say speaking of assholes, but maybe now we open up for questions. So and Paul is holding his hands up. I love it, Paul, because Paul, I was going to identify you for our first question because of everybody on this call right now, I believe that Paul has had more of your whiskeys than anybody else. Okay. So, Eric, can you unmute Paul? And Paul, if you can ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll open up to other people.
Well, ironically, I've had so many of the whiskeys, I have significantly fewer questions. And I harass Jeff with all my questions all the time, so...
Well, our group, though. I mean, is there anything in particular that you think might, be enlightening for us from some of your discussions with Jeff and some of the bottles that you've had?
Well, I think I do have one question, but it's probably a little hard. And that's kind of going back to the topic of Joshua Hatton and everything. One thing that they do that I find unique for many of us who are Scotch whiskey lovers is they find other spirits that somebody who loves the Scotch whiskey profile really kind of goes towards. And lately their, track is with the rums that they're sourcing and everything. And they sell it as, they find rums for people who like, whiskey, step 1, and people who like Scotch whiskey, step 2. So there is a huge overlap I've found with people who, are normally more of the Scotch bend as opposed to the, bourbon bend, that really find themselves liking your whiskey quite a bit. anything that you can kind of attribute that to?
Well, I mean, it's funny if you look at. I mean, you've been to our place, so it's a Scotch pot still. At the end of the day, we don't have any plates. I mean, the first still I had, had a side mount whiskey column, and we never used the deflecmator, never used any of the plates. I mean, I shouldn't say it never did, but it never worked well for me. So we're a simple double pot still distillation. I mean, just like any Scotch, well, most Scotch, at least that I know of, producers do. And partly it's just kind of what worked for me. And, some of the first whiskey I made was not great. So you call some consultants in and, they give you an idea how to do it. And this is like, here's how we do it. And here are the cut points we'd make. And, never really looked back from there. And that's kind of I mean, you've tried the rum. So, I mean, I think compared to most of our local producers, we go probably more tail deep than they do. So, it was a white rum, very flavorful. Maybe it's too flavorful. I don't know. But there was all these great fruity notes at the end. So we just kind of rolled with it. So I guess that's just the style. I guess if you'd say we had a house style, that's kind of, our heads cut is way bigger than average. Like so we make a malted rye, so does Quincy Street. His heads cut's going to say 3%, 3% of proof gallons in is going to be his out. Ours is going to be closer to 10 to 12. But then our overall yield is actually higher than his, which tells me we're going way more tail deep than he is. Which, I mean, I haven't tried that many different white whiskeys coming out of Scotland. I've had a few up in the corporate candy land of downtown Binny's, but you never know, is that even really what they're putting in the barrel, or was that like let's send a really clean sample to, I don't.
I've got to mention something. A few years ago, some of my friends from Philadelphia were here in Chicago for a weekend, and we stopped by Binny's, and Brett happened to be there, and we were chatting, and he came out and he said, "Oh, I've got something for you." And you mentioned white whiskey, what comes off of the stills, and he gave me it was a sampling bottle, probably about, and it looked like about 375 mils, a small bottle, handwritten on it, and it was from Buffalo Trace, 151 proof. Okay. It was white, not colored, 151 proof. He said straight off. Okay. And he just gave it to me. And the scary thing was, it was actually drinkable. Okay.
It was very tasty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can really tell how that becomes Buffalo Trace.
Yeah. Yeah, it was incredible stuff. So, but let me be quiet again here. Other people who are raising their hands. I know Todd mentioned. Todd, I thought you had a question maybe about the smoke and see in the yard bag or something.
Oh no, I just felt vindicated because when we were having that discussion, I said, "Is it possible it's Ardbeg?" Like, no, it's Lefroy. It's totally Lefroy. And I feel like
So what you're saying is that we're both right, is what you're saying.
We're both right. Yes.
Okay, but it almost sounds like you might be a little bit more right than I was, because I tasted the Lefroy. I didn't really taste the Ardbeg as much, and you tasted the Ardbeg too.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that, but yes.
I'm okay. I'm okay with that.
Slightly more right, because the nose was all Lefroy.
Yeah.
But I picked up some Ardbeg on the palate.
Got it. So Jeff, actually, since we're mentioning Ardbeg and Lefroy, when you buy a bottle of Scotch, I mean, what Scotches do you like? Do you lean yourself towards the Islas?
I don't know what I would say. I mean, I guess if I look at what's on my shelf, if I was to go grab one right now, I'd probably grab my Springbank off
Springbank. Yeah.
shelf.
There are many fans of Springbank here. Many fans of Springbank here.
So that's kind of my go-to. And, I always need a little bit of salinity if I'm going to deal with smoke. Like Highland Park, I can't stand it. So I'm kind of a funny, and there's nothing wrong with the whiskey. That's not what I mean. I just, I need the salinity as a balancing point. And to me, there's salinity to Springbank, which kind of balances the smoke there.
What also explains why you like the Lefroy too.
Well, and so it's funny. I mean, the when I started playing around, figuring out and doing peated finishes, I still wasn't really a peated whiskey guy, but it was, I do the poor man's test. So the poor man's test is, okay, we want to do a special blend with the malted rye that was the Thomas Fawcett's and Sons that has this big grassy note. So go to the store, get a bottle of cognac, get a bottle of, at that time it was actually Highland Park, which is why it's on my shelf. We played with rum, played with port, played, whatever, and tried various things. And the peated whiskey was my favorite, but then at the time call around and couldn't find it anywhere. And I reached out to Westlands to see if they would sell some barrels. It got, totally ignored. And then, just kind of fortuitous, popped up with Rocky Mountain Barrel suddenly had peated Isla whiskey barrels coming in. They couldn't tell me what they were, but that batch was Lefroy, and the second one was Ardbeg. So, like I said, the first two barrels, the Lefroy barrels, and that was funny too, because they came, and I'm trying to remember, I think they were Maker's Mark barrels, right? First. So I'm looking on the truck, and it says Maker's Mark on it, and then I kind of freaked out. I'm like, because I've been trying to find these damn Scotch barrels for so long, and they sent me bourbon barrels, and I was all pissed off. And then you kind of got within 10 feet, and you could just smell the peat wafting off the thing. You're like, oh no, it's right. Spin it around. The other side says Lefroy, and you could see like the, from the U.S. to Scotland back to the U.S.
Right.
And the whole life and history of the barrel is kind of fun.
That's fascinating.
That's cool.
Yeah. So what other questions do we have on here?
Michael Bloom.
I'm shocked that Bloom has a question.
Yeah, I can guess the next person with the question too. We're a good pattern here. So you used the word Solera process a couple times at the top of the call, and I joined 4 minutes in. But I'd love you to talk about how you define what is Solera process to you, and how do you manage that? How do you keep track of what's part of the Solera?
Well, keeping track is, the federal government does a really good job of making sure I keep track of what's in what. But so in our case, the American oak portion of that is fully emptied. So you're looking at, on average, 53-gallon barrel at 2.5 years, fully emptied. And then the French oak are a mixture of 53-gallon French oak barrels and 500-liter French oak barrels. Some charred, some just toasted. And then the Oloroso mixture of 250-liter and 500-liter. So the point on those is they never drop below half, right? So we'll do a bottling, you move half off the Oloroso, then move the French oak over, and then empty American on it. Now, we've been going below half recently just because, it's interesting to look at all the negativity we're seeing with COVID and what it's doing to producers. But honestly, it may have slowed down our growth, but our revenue is up 100% so far this year. Wow. Suddenly we're running into the issue of, I wish I had made more, but that is what it is. So it's a question what to do about it too. So, the Solera will stay in-house. It was a question I was going to ask this group though, is if something like Smoke and Sea suddenly was 5-year-old MGP into French oak, into Lefroy barrels, how everybody feels about that. It's the only product to me that seems like it could be done. We've never sourced anything before, but I'm kind of agnostic on it.
Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up because we've heard different opinions about sourcing. Nick Nagley, he doesn't do, he doesn't source at all. He never has from the beginning. The Blom brothers, though, they did source. And I saw Michael Nolan with his hand up right there, so I'm going to let him take over right now.
Well, I've got a question, but I'll make a comment first. The friends I have in the business have been telling me MGP has just gotten insanely expensive. The cost of their products just jumped so much lately. the question is steering it back to barrels. You're bringing in these islet barrels. Two parts to it. How long are you aging in those barrels? And then how often, or have you used these barrels multiple times?
I've attempted to use them multiple times, but honestly, they've given up most of their peat in the first use. It's almost like what I'll do then is for the next batch, you know, I get them when I can get them. Is part of the problem. So, like right now, you know, I have some original first fill, refill, however you want to say it, first fill Lefroy barrels there. But I'll also take the ones that we've just emptied and refill them, waiting to put them on new Lefroy barrels when they come in. But at the moment, you know, once a week I ask Northeast Barrel and I ask Rocky Mountain Barrel when they're going to see more. And part of that sounds like, you know, COVID issue, the brewery's getting hit. They don't have the interest in it. So taking over a full container is an interesting problem. And I don't have the wherewithal to handle a full container myself. That said, as far as I think the youngest anything has been in the Isla barrels is 2 months, and the longest is a year. And on average, it's probably like 4 to 6 months. But you know, your sales is ahead, then suddenly, you know, you're emptying them at 2 months. You know, kind of the criteria is it always has to be good and it has to achieve what you want. I look at it as, you know, maybe this is a bad way to look at it, but the supplier side of this is like, we put batch numbers on it, you know, there is variance, and that's kind of the reality. You know, even the Solera you would picture should be super consistent because it's a Solera, but it bounces around a little bit on me too, depending on what Oloroso cask we were pulling from.
Got it. So Jeff, actually, to answer your question, since you said you wanted to ask us about that, and Michael mentioned, you know, MGP has gotten expensive. To be honest, as a consumer, I mean, if I like a distillery and if I trust the distillery to put something good in the bottle, you know, if you were to put something in the bottle that you thought was good, given that I like your stuff, I don't think that I would necessarily have an objection. You know, it's the kind of thing where you know, I don't know about labeling. You know, labeling is nothing that I really know about. I guess I would, you know, fall back on you. But if you think that you would be able to produce something that is, you know, that honors smoke and see, if you're using juice from somebody else, I mean, who am I to tell you not to do it?
Well, you're you because I'm asking the question. No, right. I mean, it's, yeah. You know, enthusiastic supporters, let's say, whether or not it's a turnoff or not. For me, you know, as to the prices of MGP, honestly, it looks like it's coming down, because for the longest time, I mean, if you go back 10 years ago, when I first started looking at this, and there was a family project looking at it with my dad, I was very anti-sourcing. I think it was just because of my background in finance. Just the idea of making something was way more appealing, and then making something original, which is why you end up with a malted rye instead of a rye. You end up with this funky Solera bourbon. There's the idea of making things that nobody else was. I mean, the Solera, honestly, was me blending at home. It was I bought a bottle of Rhymageddon, you know, full disclosure. Didn't love it. I love some of the parts of it, but I was like, it was just too intense for me. And blended it. I was blending it with Breckenridge bourbon, so something light. And I really liked that combination. So it was just kind of reverse engineering it. And by trial and error, which is funny because in retrospect, you call the guys at Corsair that would have given me the mash bill, no problem. But at the time, I was trial and erroring it for no apparent reason.
They're mad scientists there, the way that they combine different things.
Well, so like the one of the original Binny's picks, right, was the first batch we did, and it was the chocolate malted rye was 8%, which now it's super. Well, I've been bumping it back up over time as it gets older. The grain note drops more. So the chocolate malt went from, say, we moved down to 2% was kind of our standard. Now we're up to 2.5%. 2.7 depending on the batch, but right. So that one's just a chocolate bomb. So they took a full sherry cask.
Which one's that? What are you looking at now?
The one Paul was flashing up there. So it was barrel 153. It was an Oloroso barrel.
Okay.
And it was at 8% chocolate malted rye.
Okay.
So the downside of selling them the whole barrel was then if I ever wanted to bump the chocolate up with the one that was a chocolate bomb, it was never there to blend around with anymore. But it was,
I mean, do you like being able to say that you've never sourced? Is that something that you enjoy being able to say from both a marketing perspective and a pride perspective?
Well, only to the extent that I never sourced, and I like that. Well, I guess there were people that did it poorly. I think we'd all admit where pretend like they make it right and they source. Then you have ones that, High West, for instance, I kind of heard originally they sort of went that route, but realistically, they made some very unique and cool whiskeys, and for the most part, it was all sourced originally.
Right.
And I think they did a great job. Honestly, part of the reason I never did it is because I called the Illinois Liquor Commission and asked if I could have a craft distilling license and source whiskey, and the definitive answer was no from the legal department. And then you look around and CH and Blom and all of them are doing it, and you're like, well, teaches you don't ask questions, just do what you want to do and ask forgiveness, right? It's
right.
Because then you look at the reporting with the state, they'd have no way of telling, right? Nothing is manufactured in Illinois until you put it in a bottle. So it was there was no way they'd know where the liquid was coming for to put it in the bottle. So, yeah, but as you say, for a long time, a lot of it got so expensive, it was kind of hard to, what would you want to do? I imagine in the future, you might get more independent bottling going on in the US as you have this huge proliferation of craft distillers, and you have to think there's going to be a decent amount that have made more liquid than they can sell. And then, you're going to have this huge palette to play with. The part of the problem with doing the whole thing for all this time was you had like 9 producers, and not even all of them were selling to the bulk market. So realistically, if there were 3 people to buy from, it doesn't make it that interesting.
Yeah, I remember when Templeton came out, and there was this huge outcry in all these articles, and that's when the general public learned about MGP. Because it got so much press about what they actually were and where they were coming from. It was fascinating stuff.
I have a question back to Jeff real quick, which is if you can produce enough whiskey to fill casks to continue to do it with your own juice, why not do that? So what do you gain by being able to source?
Oh, it's just, honestly, it's filling a production issue. It was kind of, so we have 2 facilities at this point. One honestly is more of a tasting room and cocktail bar than it is. I mean, we kind of almost use it as a lab. It's got a little 45-gallon pot still. It's electric. I honestly hate to turn it on. It's so slow, and but it allows us a little playground to kind of do whatever. I mean, back there, we make bourbon ice cream. Like I don't care. We just have fun. But so
we might have to talk a little more about that bourbon ice cream in a minute, but I'll let you keep answering.
Well, I should tell you, it was not. I don't know if you keep kosher, but it was a bacon maple. Was probably the best. So it was.
You're killing me.
The number one favorite for everybody was a bourbon barrel-aged maple syrup used to make candied bacon, and then a maple bacon ice cream, maple bacon bourbon ice cream with actual bits of candied bacon in it.
Yeah, you're killing me. Yeah, you're killing me.
It sounds crazy, but
yeah, Todd is laughing hilariously here. I mean, you are killing me, because also Eric and I have competed together on kosher barbecue competitions. So we both have smokers. We go to kosher barbecue competitions and all that stuff, and we have friends who do the bacon stuff all the time. It just kills us. Yeah, it's amazing. But please go back to Michael's question. Sorry to distract you there. He said ice cream. So Michael, did he answer your question?
I think so. It was basically it fills a production gap in what you're doing. So you could get the volume you needed at the time those barrels were empty in order to fill them. Is that?
Right. So it's essentially saying we have enough, say, 4 grain to supply the market for all the markets we're in. We have enough Solera as long as we don't steal too much from the Solera for the smoke and see. And if we were to do it, so like right now, what we could do is I could take X amount from the 4 grain and use that to fill smoke and sea barrels. But then there's certainly no place to go to, for instance, bulk up or supply of 4 grain if we run into supply issues. I mean, it's just literally, you know, our sales being double this year what they were last year, and spending, you know, a couple months this year just making hand sanitizer, and honestly being the main one that does all the distillation and the kids e-learning. You know, I work nights, so after this I'll go in and bottle. So it's just, you know, kind of, you know, I'd feel safer from a production point of view knowing, hey, we went and bought 4 or 8 barrels and 2 batches of smoke and see to kind of fill a gap work. I mean, we might do it and then it changes too much, and then, you know, it might become, okay, we created a totally new product because it shouldn't have been used as smoke and see. So then, well, we threw them in Sauterne casks, so it's a peated Sauterne bourbon. You know, maybe that's where they end up. I don't know. But it was, you know, I originally asked Paul, since, you know, I bounce ideas off him, and it was like, I don't know, how do you feel about it? He's like, well, why don't you ask the group? And yeah, sure. Let's.
Well, Nolan, do you have an opinion on that? Because I know you and I've talked about sourcing before. Do you have any opinion on that in particular?
I think it's mostly boils down to transparency. If you have a consumer base that has an expectation, you just have to be careful with that. And I think if you tell people, hey, this batch is sourced, and you're transparent and tell people that, I think you'll be okay. I think as long as you're not trying to play it off as saying, yeah, this is juice we made, I think you're fine.
Yeah, I agree. Debbie, do you have an opinion? I see you're downing something there. What are you drinking tonight, Debbie? Because you seem to be enthusiastically downing something.
I'm with you. I got the Solera.
Okay, so you're also doing the Solera. Do you have any opinion on this discussion we're having as to whether if they were to source something?
I think I'm in the same place as Michael. I think it's all about transparency. I think as long as you're upfront about it and not pretending, I could care less where the juice is coming from. If you feel good about the juice and you're willing to be honest about it, I think that's all that matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to what I mentioned before, which is the word trust. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I've bought several bottles of yours over the years. I've enjoyed them all. They've always been good. If you feel that there's something that is worthy of being put under your label, you know, I would trust that you have given us something that would be good. You know, so that's what it really comes down to. And I agree with the transparency thing. I think that's a very good point. If you're transparent, great. You know, nothing wrong with that at all. Anybody else want to raise their hand and express an opinion on that? Anybody want to disagree with us?
I had a separate question, although I agree with the transparency thing. As long as I know what I'm buying, I'm happy, and the distiller's willing to stand behind it. But I had a question on a separate topic, if that's allowed at this point.
Sure.
And this will probably be our last question before I sum it up, because we're pretty close to an hour here.
I was intrigued when you were discussing the mash bill of the Solera bourbon, because it seems like one unexplored area in particularly American whiskey is, I see Paul getting excited preemptively, is exploring grains in the same way that like craft brewers do. And you mentioned chocolate malts and things like that. Is that something that you're interested in exploring in the future, different malts and different grains?
Yeah, and I know as I start playing with single malt, we'll definitely do it. I have a feeling it'll work a little bit better with single malt, just in the sense that, to me, the Solera from batch 1 till now has pretty drastically changed, just because it was so grain forward initially that all those chocolate notes were clear and kind of slapped you in the face. Now that it sits so much longer in oak, I honestly, at times I find it almost confusing. Like, I wouldn't blame somebody for not picking it up as chocolate. They pick it up as, you know, oh, maybe he's doing direct fire and it's kind of a burnt note coming across. So for instance, like that 2% special B, probably over time, I'll just get rid of it because I don't taste it anymore. Like, there's a roasty note, but I think at this point it's more coming from that chocolate malt. I mean, that's part of the thing, is not everything stands up to the barrel. I mean, if, let's say we were, you know, in general, our workhorse is yeast is Pasteur Champagne, Red Star Pasteur Champagne. And it's a very clean profile, but, you know, occasionally if we use Daddy or something, so Distiller's Active Dry Yeast, it has a huge banana note to it. So it's funny, if you're making Solera and you're using that, it smells like chocolate bananas in there. And I mean, it's super, super on the nose on the White Dog, but, you know, 4 years later, you know, I don't pick it up at all. There's no banana there. The chocolate's there, but it's so much more muted, which I was saying why we were bumping it up. And then partly I've been laying down barrels without chocolate malt at all and being like, do we like this better? Are we willing to concede that maybe some of these things, or you know, because it's kind of hard to say that. I wouldn't say I liked it better initially. It's just the product has changed, but I don't really want to leave it as it was in a 15-gallon barrel for 1 year, and that's, you know, that's where we want to end up. That seems like, you know, I always wanted to move it to a larger barrel. That was part of why do a Solera, was to create a smooth transition. But I guess in a way it made a smooth transition, but to a different product essentially than where it started. Their profiles changed so much.
Got it. Todd, did he answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Great, wonderful. So what I'd like to do, everybody, if you do not have any alcohol in your glasses, please pour yourselves all a dram. Eric, if you could, actually, you can't unmute everybody anymore. Everybody, if you can all, because of Zoom's privacy settings, if you could all unmute yourselves, that'd be great, and give everybody a second to unmute. And if we could all raise a glass and say cheers to our special guest, Jeff Walsh. Say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
And Jeff, we appreciate very much your time with us tonight. We all look forward to when we can meet in person again at World of Whiskeys and other places right across the table from each other and chat and sample your wares. And again, everybody, thank you very much. Let's stop the recording right now. Jeff, you are free to leave. Anybody who wants to hang around for a little bit of an after party, please feel free to do so. But again, Jeff, thank you very much, and cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.